So, good afternoon to everybody. We will continue today on the chapter about population change in the US. But I just wanted to talk quickly about the result of the exam. So we had exam 1 this last Tuesday, and like around 26% of the people got an A. And if you consider also your quizzes, you add everything, the quizzes and the exams, and then divide by 25, maximum possible points, like around 20% of the people have reached an A. So I think, everybody can improve. And what I suggest is trying to read the textbook, or at least the slides before the classes. And then after the classes, after the lectures, instead of answering the quizzes right away, if you have been missing points on the quizzes, you should try to go back to the slides, read something else that you didn't understand well in the textbook. And also you can watch specific portions of the lecture before you answer the quizzes. Today, we don't have a quiz as expected. As I mentioned, the days after following the exams, we won't have quizzes. So our next quiz is gonna be just on Tuesday, right? So if you just go back to the syllabus, it's over there. So I just suggest to you, and if you have any questions and you have some doubts about specific points, I'm really open to have office hours, and just send me an email and we can set up some time to talk for whenever it's convenient for you. So as I mentioned, like the days after exams, we don't have quizzes, so the next quiz is gonna be just on Tuesday, right? The same thing after exam 2, and the same thing after exam 3. The other thing, as you have seen, when I post the quizzes are due at noon on the day after the lecture. And I set up in Canvas in a way that it will release the correct answers only by 1 p.m. the next day. So the deadline is at noon, and then by 1 p.m. you can see the correct answers to the questions. The exam, I did not post the correct answers yet because I knew that some students had some excusable absences to don't take the exam. So as soon the final students take it, I will post it. So it probably will be posted tomorrow by 1 p.m. the correct answers to the questions in the exam 1. And Zoom is going to start requiring passwords to all meetings, and we don't have a password for this meeting, so I will update this information in the syllabus, in the course website, everything. I will include here the complete link that you can access just by clicking on it that already has the password included. And I will also inform the password here. And probably the password is going to be just the code of the class. We didn't have any problems yet of people entering the room. So probably it's going to be SOCI 312. And I will also send you an email with that information. So next Tuesday, you should use the link that already has the password included here. Or if you enter just through this link, it's going to ask for the password. Cool? Any questions? All good? So we will continue on the lecture about population changes in the US. And we covered up to topic 3, changes of origin of undocumented immigrants. So we will start now on increasing ages at first marriage. So from this topic 4 of this lecture until the time of exam 2, that's going to be the material that exam 2 is going to cover. But quizzes, remember, quizzes, any material that we saw since the beginning of the course until the day of the quiz, I can still ask questions about them, right? So it can be about anything before, including the previous chapters. Cool? So slide 22, related to increasing ages at first marriage. One of the other important changes in terms of demographic, indicators that we have been seeing in the US is exactly an increase in ages at first marriage. So people are postponing the ages in which they get married. And this is an important indicator because as people postpone the age in which they get married, this is also related to a postponement in the age that people have children. So age at first marriage, it's a good indicator of whether people might postpone having children. And when people postpone having children, and as we talked before, fertility, we measure that for women. When women postpone having children in specific years, the fertility levels might decline a lot, exactly because they're postponing. And then when they reach the age that they want to have children, fertility might start to coming back, right? And that's important because it might create these really low levels of fertility in specific times. But then if you keep going into that population, the fertilities might come up a little bit. But overall, here in the specific graph, we are emphasizing that the median age at first marriage has been increasing over time since the 70s. What is the median age? That's the age that separates those that got married. 50% of those that got married back in 1890, they were older than 26 among men, and 50% of them were younger than 26. For women, the median means that 50% of women back in 1890, 50% of these women were older than 22, and 50% were younger than 22. What you see is that there was actually a decline in the ages in which people got married for the first time, up to the 60s. And this is usually related to the economy is doing good, the people have better resources in urban areas to improve their lives, they get good jobs, so people get married earlier, so the age in which they get married drops. But as starts to take more time for people to finish the desired education, and then getting a job, and then getting married, all that process of people trying to reach higher levels of education, getting a better job before getting married, that makes the first age at marriage increase overall for the population. So you first see a decline in the age of first marriage and then an increase in more recent years because of urbanization, because of people are getting, it's more expensive to build a family, and people want to get better education before they get married. And because of unemployment, usually people, they decide to get married when they have a more stable life condition. That creates this pattern. Another thing that's important to see here is the differentials between men and women. Men, on average, get married at older ages than women. right? This specific graph here doesn't show what I'm going to say now, but it's exactly because on average, men, they married women that are younger than men. And so you see these differentials here. But another interesting thing that you see, so we saw first the trend over time, declining and then increasing more recent years. You see that men, they marry at older ages than women. And another important thing from this graph is that the differentials between men and women have been declining over time. Exactly what Patrick said. Because in previous centuries, decades, years, usually women, or they didn't go to have higher education, didn't have like as many women going to college in those previous decades, and they tended to get married at younger ages. As they start going to college, getting higher education, and waiting to get a good job before they get married, then their lives in society start being more similar as the contribution of men in society. So they start to be, still there is a differential, cultural difference here, but exactly because the socioeconomic conditions, they start to be more similar for men and women, you see this decline in the differentials. So whenever you analyze a table, a graph, it's important to try to capture most information as you can from it. In this case, trends changing over time, differentials by sex, and the differential by sex has been declining over time. It was like 2 years overall, 4 years overall, 26 for men, 22 for women. And now it's around only 2 years difference, right? From 4 years difference to 2 years difference. Cool? And also, overall as well, and related to the previous topic, we have been seeing a decrease in percentages of persons marrying overall in the country. And this information here is focused only on women with at least 15 years of age, and data from 1950 to 2014. Why the data here is only for every 10 years, and more recent years, we have 4 more years here, because these years here, they are based on census data, 1950, 60, 1970, 1980, 1990. And then in more recent years, the US Census Bureau captured this information every year, okay? So what you see is that over time, the percentage of women with at least 15 years of age getting married declines. But that might be related not because these women here, they will never get married in their lives. That might be related exactly to the postponement in the age of having children, which is the previous slide. They're postponing the age at first marriage, and by postponing the age at getting married, overall in a specific year, you see declines on the proportion of people getting married. And here, again, focus on women with at least 15 years of age. The proportion of those never getting married increased from 20% to almost 30% among women with at least 15 years of age. And the percentage of those getting divorced increased over time. It's more culturally accepted. But as I'm going to show in the following graph, the trends of divorce is really related to the trends of getting married. And widowed, we see a little increase and then it's declining more recent years. Probably because women still live on average more than men, but men now had improvements in their mortality, that their life expectancy increases, and the differentials between the life expectancy of men and women get closer. So men tend to die a little closer to the time that their partners will die, and then the overall percentage of women widowed declines. So for each one of these trends here of women married, never married, divorced, and widowed, there is a story behind it, and it's important for us to understand it, okay? And this is a graph that I got from the CDC, and this is a specific author. He collected data from the CDC, and then he made this graph available. And this is pretty much data for 144 years of marriage and divorce in the US. So the range here is a little longer than what we saw in the previous graph that was from 1950 to 2014. Here goes from a little before 1870 until a little after 2010. And these are also, these are rates of getting married and divorced, but it's rates not in percentage terms, but per 1,000 people. Per capita? Per capita, and this is men and women, right? So here is women, because here we get in the numerator the number of married women with at least 15 years of age divided by the overall number of women with at least 15 years of age and multiply by 100. Here we get the number of people married, men and women, and divide by the overall size of that population. It's not getting only women, and it's not getting people with only at least 15 years of age. It's getting everybody in the denominator, right? And those are the, and here we multiply by 1,000. Exactly because these numbers would get too small because we are getting men and women in the denominator and also children below the age of 15. The author multiply at the end by 1,000, not by 100. But what's interesting here to see is the overall trends. And then you see the trends in marriage rates in the blue line here. The World War I ends, and then it tends to make people start to get married. They see another possibility for their lives. People are more optimistic. But then around the Great Depression, when people start to lose jobs, have economic issues that make people postpone their getting married, and the overall rate of getting married declines. And then the country starts to improve economically, get better conditions for people, the unemployment rates decline, and then the rates of getting married increases. And then after World War II, still we have the baby boom. That's where we see increases in fertility, but at the same time, the overall rate of marriage starts to decline, exactly because now we start to see more women going to the labor market, investing in their education before they get married. So in that specific year, you see a decline. And then after the 60s, you see an increase again. In more recent years, you see a decline. But what I mentioned before is that whenever people are analyzing divorce rates, and remember, these rates here are by 1,000. That's why I'm not saying percentage. Whenever people talk about divorce rates, people really get concerned that our society is changing our norms, our morals, and everything because mortality, divorce rates has been increasing over time. But to understand divorce rates, why we have these increasing rates of divorce rates over time, you have to put it together with marriage rates. And they pretty much kind of mirror each other, right? Okay, the differentials between marriage rates and divorce rates See, they were really wide, and now they are much closer to each other. So yeah, now our society changed, culturally speaking. Getting divorced is more acceptable. So women don't have to stay married with a husband that is not treating well the wife in that specific household. So people get married, but they also have higher chances of getting divorced because culturally it's more acceptable for people to get divorced. So overall, the differentials here between marriage and divorce rates, they decline over time. But the trends of divorce follow the same trends as marriage. As you have more people getting married, then you're gonna have more chances of people getting divorced. How is this divorce rate calculated here? Number of people that got divorced in the numerator divided by the number of people in that population, including children, in the denominator. Because here is not saying anything about age of people. But to be in the numerator, to get divorced, what I have to have done before? I have to get married before I get divorced. So these rates here really mirror the trends in marriage. And as you have less people getting married, consider the size of the population, taking into account the size of the population, the rates in divorce also decline. And you start to see that the trends here of marriage are really similar to the trends in divorce. The decline in the rates of divorce in more recent years is not because people are getting more conservative, going back to old style in the household, old cultural habits or norms. It's because they mirror the fact that now you have less people getting married considering the overall size of the population, right? So it's important to understand the data and go into detail with the data. And see how long time I'm spending with each one of these graphs, because we have to really see what the information is showing us. And it's showing us trends over time, differentials between marriage and divorce, and how these differentials have been declining. And as they decline, the rates of divorce really mirror the rates of marriage. Okay? The sixth point, increasing levels of cohabitation, related to the fact that people are postponing get married, that the overall percentage of people getting married declined over time, and the percentage of people getting married declined over time, and we saw exactly for women. And this graph here is centering the analysis on women between the ages of 19 and 44. And in percentage terms, so I multiply by 110. So these are percentage of women between these ages who cohabited prior to their first marriage. And then we have data from 1965 until 2009. So what we see, that overall, the percentage of women who cohabited before they got married have been increasing a lot in these last decades, and it's somehow more stable in these last years. So in the high 60s, like around between 65 and 70%. And that's related to changes in how women are viewed in our society. So women also start to invest in their education, to get better jobs. That's related to postponing marriage. But they might find their partners and they cohabited with the partner before getting married, because cohabitation is now also more culturally accepted in our society. right? Again, related to all these patterns, we also see an increase in percentage of births to unwed mothers. Exactly because you start to see an increase in percentage of couples, of women between these ages who live with their partners before getting married, there is a chance, of course, that they will have children before formally getting married. So this here, we see the percentage of births to unmarried women by race and ethnic and Hispanic origin between 1959 and 2013. So in this case here, when we are saying that we see overall the total, the black line here, only 5.3% of women in the US back in 1959 had babies before getting married. And now, by 2013, almost 41%. What do you think contributed to the big jump from the early 70s to the late 70s? To the early 70s to the late 70s. It's exactly the idea, you're talking about this, right? The rate here, the line here is much more steep than in more recent years. Exactly because in the 60s and in the 70s, women, you start to have more equal roles by gender in our society, both in terms of education opportunities and job opportunities. So women start to enter, to invest in their education, try to get a job first. That's related to the fact that they will postpone getting married. Postponing getting married, they might still live with their partners in cohabitation. And by having a partner, they have a higher chance of getting pregnant and having a child before getting married. But what is interesting, is that clear, Eric?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So what is interesting here in the US, whenever you are doing this analysis of socioeconomic and demographic indicators in our case, is to break that information by race ethnicity. In this case, showing data for non-Hispanic Black women, for Hispanic women, and for non-Hispanic white women. So non-Hispanic white women, they are less likely than these other two race ethnicity groups to have children before getting married. And non-Hispanic Black have higher levels, and Hispanic, they are in between the two. But the overall level differentials between them have been declining over time. Before Hispanic women were close to white women, and now they're actually closer to African American women. But what is related to all these differentials by race ethnicity? Exactly because African American women, they tend to have lower educational and job opportunities in the country that make them have lower chances to get married. It's related to that, what I mentioned before about the percentage of women getting married and the increase in the age at first marriage. When people are not economically stable, when people did not reach the level of education that they wanted to reach, that decreases the chances of them forming a family through marriage. But they still could be cohabiting with their partners. And then the chances of having babies before getting married is high. So that's really high. You could say, wow, 71.5% of women in 2013 among African American women, they have babies before getting married. That's a lot. And you could say, wow, that's a lot of pressure on this woman that they are having these babies by themselves in the household. This last statement that I said is not completely true, because this woman might have their partners living in the household with them. They might be cohabiting, still have the support of the partner, not through marriage, but they might have a partner in the household, okay? So you just have to be a little bit careful. These are women who had children before formally getting married, but not necessarily there is no partner in the household, because they might be living in cohabitation, right? And this is another graph to show the percentage of all births to unmarried women by age of the mother. How old are the unmarried women who had babies? Among women who are under the age of 15, among all those women here who have babies, 99.2% of them are unmarried. And that's reasonable to think, right? The overall numbers, the numerator might be much, much smaller of women that young having children. As women get older, the percentage of those women between the ages of 35 and 39 that have children and who are unmarried drops to 21.2, right? So this is the percentage of women in this age group who have babies, but the women are unmarried. And of course, the overall number of women below the age of 15 who have children, the numerator is really small, but the denominator is also small in this case. So you have this, the overall number of women below the age of 15 having babies is small. But among those that have children in such young age, almost all of them are unmarried. So the denominator is small, but the numerator is pretty much composed by all women in this group because they are not married. Cool? So that's the end of this chapter 13 about population trends in the US from our textbook. And now we enter in an important topic, an important chapter that kind of is the foundation for everything else that we're going to see in this course. So, the chapter 2 is related to theories of demography. These are overall knowledge that we have about our society that help us understand the current society and also new problems that arise in this specific society. So, this chapter here, I broke it down in these topics: introduction to doctrines and theories, early writings about population, and some of this material here, I got it from another textbook. So there are some tables here with early writings about population, some doctrines and theories. That is just to give you an example that historically, a lot of people have been trying to understand demography already. And I don't expect you to memorize all those doctrines and early writings, but it's good for you to understand that this debate about demographic changes over time is something that human beings have been debating for several centuries. And then I will talk about the demographic transition theory. The demographic transition theory, I mentioned to you guys before on the chapter about world population changes over time. when I talked about the stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the demographic transition. First, mortality declines, and afterwards, the birth rates decline. So we go just a little deeper on that. And the demographic transition theory is focusing more on changes related to fertility and mortality. And then I will go a little more on theories that try to explain fertility trends over time, theories that try to explain changes in health and mortality, and also explain specifically the demographic theory of mortality, which is related to this demographic transition theory here. And then we'll talk about theories to explain migration. Start by giving a summary of the migration terms, and then go into theories that try to explain both internal and international migration. As you know, in our course website, I have there some videos that might be helpful to complement the readings of this course. So on this specific week or this specific chapter about theories of demography, this video done by the Population Reference Bureau and by the American Museum of Natural History, they are good to understand these changes, what is behind these changes in population trends over time. This is just a silly song for us to understand demographic transition. But these two videos here are important, are kind of like helpful for us as extra material to understand these topics. As I had posted this one about changes in age structure, and these first 3 ones here about introduction to demography. So, starting on, whenever you're talking about theories, it's just important for us to understand some major terms in theory. And this applies to any class that you might have been taking now or in the future. Whenever you're talking about science, it's good to know the differences between deduction and induction. When we are talking about a study, a problem in our society, that we already have some knowledge about it, previous researchers, previous social scientists already tried to explain why fertility and mortality decline, and then now I'm trying to explain a specific society right now, I can use this previous knowledge that was tested and validated in previous years to come up with preliminary answers to my research questions. So let's just come up with a research question here. Why are the fertility levels, number of children that women are having, declining in African countries in more recent decades? Our previous theories based on studies related to the developed countries and other mid-developed countries say that exactly because you have improvements in the sewer system, in the water system, in health habits, that makes mortality decline. And when people start to realize that they don't have to have as many children in order for some of them to survive to older ages, fertility starts to decline as well. So that's one preliminary answer to my question. This is hypothesis 1. Another hypothesis is because now the society is getting more urbanized and it's more expensive to have more children and put them in school and reach a good educational attainment and then get good jobs. It's expensive. I decide to have fewer children. So the fact that mortality decline among children, it's a factor that explains the declines in fertility, one. Another one is the fact that now you have much more expensive way of life to provide wealth to your children, so you will also decline the levels of fertility. It's more expensive to give good education and good jobs for your future, for your children in the future. Third, previous theories have been also saying that access to more affordable contraceptive methods make women better control their reproductive lives and then postpone the age of having children, and that declines fertility. That's the third option. So one, declines in infant mortality rate influences in declines in fertility. The lifestyle in urban areas declines the chances of having children. Access to more affordable contraceptive methods declines the chances of having children. These are three answers to my questions before I even look at that specific population. So the hypotheses are the preliminary answers to my questions. And these hypotheses are based on previous knowledge about that specific problem. Not maybe exactly about that country, but historical examples of other countries might help me understand that specific country. What do I have to do now? I have to test my hypothesis. And how do I test my hypothesis? I have to go to that specific country and collect data about it. And the data can be collected in different ways. I can collect data, more quantitative data that is representative to the whole population, so I can get data from the census, from household surveys that ask women about how many children they had in all these different years of data that we have might be already collected. We can have information about where they live, rural or urban areas, whether they had a child but the child died. We can also have information about the area where the woman lives, not necessarily getting the information from her, but we might know that mortality trends decline a lot in a specific area where a woman lives over time. So we can link all this information. This is data collection. We are collecting data to observe that specific population. With this data, we test this hypothesis. Did we confirm the hypothesis that fertility is lower in countries or in areas within that country, for example, that have lower levels of mortality? Yes, so we confirm hypothesis 1. Hypothesis 2. Is fertility decline more exactly in areas that are more urbanized, in which people try to get better education, better jobs before having children? Yes, I confirm hypothesis 2. And hypothesis 3, are there areas that have more affordable access to contraceptive methods, the ones that you see declines in fertility? Yes, I confirm hypothesis 3, and that reinforces my theory, right? So these are studies that are usually based on knowledge that I had already from other studies, from other years, from other countries that help me understand this specific example. But in some cases, I might come up with a research question that's really unique and nobody actually thought about it as much. So I start by observing that specific case. Usually, induction studies, they are smaller in scale. I look, for example, wow, that specific county in the US, I have been seeing an increase in deaths related to drug overdose in recent years, and that's increasing mortality rates. And all the theory that we had before was that actually more developed areas, they tend to have lower mortality. But why in these specific areas we are seeing an increase in death due to drug overdose? So I will do an observation. Then I start seeing, hey, those people dying due to drug overdose, they seem to have a pattern. They're all related to people who got prescribed drugs that had opium as a basic, not ingredient, a basic, yeah, I think I would say ingredient, right? In the ingredients more for food, like opium as a basic item in the medicine, and then those people got addicted, and then afterwards, even after they stopped using that specific medicine, they got addicted and they started consuming heroin, and that increases the chances of those people dying through drug overdose. So I looked at some pattern, and now I came up with a specific answer to my question. Increases in all this medicine based on opium prescribed, all this increase of these prescribed drugs are increasing the chances of people getting addicted and then dying because of drug overdose. Then I will just, usually here, then I go back and collect more data and try to see if that pattern really is consistent, and that helps me create a theory. And this theory will get stronger if I collect more data and I verify similar patterns that confirm my hypothesis, and then I get stronger theories. So deduction is when it's a study that's usually based on theories, on knowledge that we already had before. Induction is when I don't have much information about that problem, so I start by observing. And this is just other diagrams that show the same thing. Deductive reasoning starts with theory, predictions, and then go to an experiment. And inductive starts with an observation, an experiment, go to generalizations, and then build a theory. Deductive is start with a theory, a general principle, and then you go to a specific case. Induction is start with a specific case, and then you go to a general principle, the theory. Deductive starts with a theory to confirm a hypothesis and tend to be quantitative research, like I said before, based on census data and household surveys, for example, that are representative to the population. Inductive starts with data, infer conclusions from the data, looking at these patterns, and it tends to be qualitative research, because I said, oh, you can look at the specific case of a specific county. But there is some recent developments with inductive theories. With all this capacity that we have now, technologically speaking, with all the computers getting so powerful, it's possible to collect a huge amount of data about a specific problem that we don't have much knowledge about it. So our observations can be millions, billions of observations, and then we look at those patterns. Even without a specific theory behind it. This kind of inductive studies that use huge amount of data without having a specific theory behind them to start collecting this data, that's what it's usually here. It's data, studies related to using big data or machine learning or artificial intelligence. What is that? Artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data. We enter some information in the computer and say, oh, collect information about people from social media, from the internet, from cell phone data, from like where the cell phone data, the cell phones of those people are located. So I'm getting information about the GPS. Get all this data. It's millions, billions of data that I can collect with computers. And the computer itself starts to understand some patterns and focus the analysis in specific subgroups. And then I start to bring more and more data. I'm starting with observation. And then with those observations, I look at patterns to build a theory. So theoretically speaking, when we are talking about the traditional way of doing science, machine learning, big data, they are not following a deductive theoretical approach. It's inductive. So it has limitations as well because we are just putting together a bunch of data and looking at associations between them. One of those videos that I just showed you here it's in another course. I think I mentioned to you before. In my homepage on methods and statistics, this class here, SOCI 420, this other video here by Professor Hans Rosling, The Joy of Stats. In a specific point of this lecture here, he interviews this researcher who is collecting information from the internet to look at patterns of associations between different variables. He doesn't have a theory behind it to explain those patterns. He just collects a bunch of different observations and looking how they relate to each other, how they correlate to each other. So that's a really clear example of induction studies. And it's using this big data approach, right? So there is not one that's better than the other. For a specific problem that you're looking, maybe it's more plausible to do deductive studies, and others do more inductive studies, right? Just put the chat back here. Good. Cool. And this slide here and all this discussion about deduction and induction theories, that applies to any science, right? Not just to social science, any science. Now we go more specifically about scientists that were concerned about population changes over time. So Ryder in 1964, he described population as an aggregate of individuals defined in spatial and temporal terms. We want to understand a specific population, but what exactly is a population? It's a group of individuals that live in a specific place, in a specific time point. In his case, his analysis is based on the model in which the population is both microdynamic and macrodynamic. Microdynamic because it's influenced by individual characteristics, but also individuals are influenced by the aggregate itself. Lotka makes a distinction between the persistence of the individual and the aggregates, always trying to understand. We have specific characteristics that make us want to have more children than other people, that make us be more likely to live longer lives, that make us be more likely to move from one country to the other. There are individual characteristics that explain mortality, fertility, and migration. But also the context where people live it's also important to understand those behaviors of people, the changes in the demographic components. Human beings die while the population aggregate does not. Individuals continue entering to replace those existing. Even when you have wars and all that, what you usually have, you might destroy a completely specific population, specific group. But what usually happens, there is a replacement, of course, a genocide, all these bad things. Throughout history, we have seen a lot of those. And overall, the society keeps existing. And as we saw in previous lectures, the overall size of the population has been increasing a lot, and it's expected to stabilize around 11 billion people. Right? So the population, it's changing, it's dynamic. Everything, like people within a specific population change. Populations, when they interact with each other, there are wars and there are all these issues, and we continue to exist. And here, it's when I said that I took this information from another textbook, from the textbook of John Weeks, to show that discussions about the demographic components, and remember, what are the demographic components? Fertility, mortality, migration. They are part of the Bible. The Genesis book, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Really saying no restriction on reproduction, right? So people, an incentive in this case for increases in fertility. Confucius, around 500 BC, governments should maintain balance between population and resources. Here, more concerned about resources and population size. Plato, population quality is more important than quantity, so we should not just let fertility goes up to higher levels. Aristotle, population should be limited, abortion might be appropriate. So, hundreds, thousands of years ago, this discussion, not specifically using the term demography, of course, as we saw, these terms are more recent, but concerns about population size, fertility, and earth resources, it has been there in our history. Cicero, population growth is necessary to maintain the Roman Empire. St. Augustine, abstinence is preferred way to deal with sexuality. Second best is to marry and procreate. And abstinence to deal with sexuality is something that we still see groups nowadays proposing this. And this is kind of like also one of the points that Thomas Malthus, as we're going to discuss in this chapter, emphasizes, exactly because of his religious roots. St. Thomas Aquinas, celibacy is not better than marriage and procreation. So there are variations there. Population growth increases occupation specialization and raises income. So in this case, Khaldun saying that actually an increase in fertility and then in population actually is good for society, because then specific people will do specific activities, economic activities, and that will generate increases in earnings. During the mercantilist era, increasing national wealth depends on growing population that can stimulate trade, because we are interested in trading with other populations. So it's good to have a bigger population to increase the chances of these trades to happen. Physiocrats, population size depends upon the wealth of the land, which is stimulated by free trade, the so-called laissez-faire, kind of like really related like the free labor market. Laissez-faire, the term in French, right? Malthus, that is one that we're going to discuss in more detail, because he was one of first ones to really talk specific about population size, What are the consequences of population growth? What are the factors? What are the causes and consequences? And his main theory emphasized that population grows exponentially. It grows much faster than food supply, than our capacity to produce food. Production of food grows arithmetically. So poverty is the result of the absence of moral restraint, exactly because people start to having children without being married, not practicing abstinence. Population growth grows in a much faster pace than the food supply, right? But all these more moral beliefs that he had is not what we have nowadays in our society. And not only that, our society enhanced in our capacity in technology to produce food, that food supply grows much faster than what he predicted. But even though these more recent trends in our capacity to produce food and our changes in what we see as as this absence of moral restraint, still his work influences more recent social scientists, which are called the New Malthusians. In this case, they mentioned that birth control measures are appropriate checks to population control. Malthus was against birth control because of his religious background. But what the New Malthusians are saying is like, hey, population growth might put a lot of pressure in a specific society, even with more capacity to produce food in a faster pace. So it's good to give opportunity to people to control their fertility through birth control. In a more Karl Marxian approach, he actually says that each society has its own law of population that determines the consequence of population growth. Poverty is not a natural result of population growth. And that's the main difference between Malthus and Marx here. Malthus says, we already talked about what is an independent variable and a dependent variable. For Malthus, population growth is the independent variable that causes poverty. For Marx, it's the other way around. Poverty and income inequality gives different opportunities to people, and that causes people to have more children and affects population growth. So for Malthus, population growth is the independent variable. For Marx, poverty is the independent variable. And this distinction is really important to understand these two theories. And what you see more nowadays are scientists trying to put them both together. Poverty and inequality explain population growth, but population growth also affects poverty and inequality. So you combine both approaches, right, to better understand the problem. 1945, the demographic transition theory is when it started to be thought, as we discussed in the chapter about world population changes over time. This is the process whereby a country moves from high birth rates and death rates to really low birth rates and death rates, those 4 stages that we saw in one graph, and the other graph had the 5 stages of the demographic transition. In the 60s, the earliest studies suggest the need to reformulate the demographic transition theory to kind of emphasize not only fertility and mortality, but also to look at specificities of specific countries and also to include migration there. The theory of demographic change and response. The demographic response made by individuals to population pressures is determined by the means available to them to respond. Causes and consequences of population change are interrelated. See, exactly what I said before, in the 60s. You start to connect these different approaches of Malthus and Marx. The causes and consequences of population change, poverty and population change, they affect each other. There is a reverse causality. It goes both ways. It's more complex. Easterling comes up with the relative cohort size hypothesis, with the idea that successfully larger young cohorts put pressure on young men's relative wages, forcing them to make a trade-off between family size and overall well-being. That's related to that discussion that I mentioned about the baby boom in the US. After World War II, you have increase in fertility, and then these children that were born after World War II, they entered the labor market in the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, and that put a negative pressure on their wages because you have more people now in labor ages competing for jobs. And that's exactly the same exercise that I did for Brazil in my dissertation that I mentioned before. So when people reach those stages and then they start to see negative effects on their earnings, that make them have fewer children because of this pressure of looking for the well-being of the family and the family size. In more recent years, and that's the continuation of this chapter here, we start looking at theories of each one of the demographic components. Theories related to health and mortality, fertility theories, theories that try to explain age composition in the country, migration rates, urbanization, and the composition of family and the household. Okay?
Can you, before we leave, can you go back to Ryder and Lotka?
Ryder and Lotka? What's up?
That's all I need.
No, Patrick just asked me to go back, but remember, these slides are all in the website, right? And so those writings that I showed before were more based on this book here by John Wick's Population Introduction to Concepts and Issues, chapter 3. And now we're going to use more the chapter 2 from our main textbook, right? So these first slides are more based on Wick's. And now we're going to see Poston and Bouvier. So in our textbook, they start to emphasize that the studies of John Stuart Mill mention the class go until 4:30, right? You don't like my class anymore. You want to leave earlier. No, it starts at 3:15 and goes until 4:30. So you're really okay, right? Because 4:15 and 4:23. So John Stuart Mill kind of emphasizes that a stationary population is better than a large one. What is a stationary population? We talked about this before, right? In the previous chapters. A stationary population is that population in which the age and sex composition are stable over time. Okay, populations, they change the levels of fertility and the mortality, but in some of these populations, they get in so low levels that they kind of stabilize over time. The rates of fertility and mortality by age of the people. And that makes the population to have a more stable age and sex structure. So the age and sex structure that used to be more like in a pyramid shape start to be more rectangular, And if there are not as many changes in fertility and mortality levels anymore, it will keep having this more rectangular shape. And population, when the overall number of births and the overall number of deaths in a population are exactly the same, the population doesn't grow anymore. Population growth equals 0. And because the levels of fertility and mortality are so low, the age-sex structure, it's constant. Remember, in previous centuries, birth rates and mortality rates were really high, and population growth also was really small. As we start to see declines in mortality, the age structure of the population changes. We start to see more children, start to get more in a pyramid shape. And now that both fertility and mortality are low, starts to go back to this more in a more stationary population, in which the population doesn't grow because the overall number of births and deaths equals to each other, and the overall levels of fertility rates and mortality rates by age of the people, by age groups, is constant. So that's what he's saying here. A large society will suffer from the growth rate of wealth not keeping up with the rate of population increase. Kind of related to that concern that if population increases too much in size, our capacity to produce, to create wealth is not going to increase as much as our population. So we will suffer, we will have higher levels of poverty and inequality, or poverty in this case. Emile Durkheim, who is also like one of the main sociologists, like who is here, sociology major, have heard about Durkheim already. He divides our societies in two types, the mechanical and the organic. The mechanical society is usually small in size and has a simple division of labor. Usually, the division of labor is by sex, by gender. Man doing activities outside of the household and woman inside the household. As the society gets larger and starts to get more complicated, specialized occupations, you start to have a more extensive division of labor. There are people that only work on agriculture, people that only work in the industry, in service activities. And of course, within each one of those, thousands of different occupations, right? So this is just to show how Durkheim, who we usually don't think as much as someone that contributed to demographic studies, actually he was proposing a division or classification of our societies based on their size and the sophistication of division of labor. So just going more in details in this, John Stuart Mill, his basic thesis was that the standard of living is a major determinant of fertility levels. The ideal state is that in which all members of society are economically comfortable rather than seeking excessive wealth. At this ideal point, the population is stabilized. The number of births and deaths will be equal in a specific population in a specific time. And people will progress culturally, morally, and socially. So he does think that controlling the size of population is important. And Durkheim, as I mentioned, a sociologist from France who based an entire social theory on the consequence of population growth. The population growth from a small society, mechanical society, to a larger society, an organic society, leads to greater division of labor and more specialization in that specific society. The struggle for existence is more severe when there are more people, with the idea that it puts more pressure on the resources that we have available in nature. In the long term, however, puts more pressure, but we develop this leads to great economic well-being as we become more specialized. So I guess that now Patrick is right. It's 4:30.
You go back to the mill.
Mill, yes. So thank you very much. We do not have a quiz today. The answer about like which specific questions you answer for exam one, which ones are the correct ones, will be available tomorrow on Canvas at 1 p.m. as usually is for quizzes. If you have any questions, I'm always open for office hours. Anything, please let me know. I will, and yeah, have a great weekend. And we see each other again on Tuesday. And then we're gonna have a new quiz on Tuesday, okay? And remember that the link to this class will change. I will add a password, really secret password. Thank you very much.